Okay, so as you know, our resolution is this House believes the United Nations has failed. So I'm just going to ask you to broadly address that and if you see any major places where the United Nations has succeeded as an organization or where they have failed.
Right. Um, well, I guess as a philosopher, I often will question the question. And so, if we're going to ask whether the UN has been a success or failure, we really need to think about what are the criteria of success, or what are we measuring the United Nations against? So we could go back to those four purposes of the UN and ask whether or not it has been able to successfully address those four different areas. Some of the failures, we would say, probably have to do with the areas of peace and security. So if you think back to 1994 and the Rwanda genocide, I mean, that would seem to be a major failure. But on the other hand, too, we have to think, did the UN learn from that? Has it been able to respond to those crises in a different way, in a more meaningful way? You look at Syria and you think, well, maybe not. Maybe we still have problems with governments, especially that are using their resources militarily, primarily against civilian populations, their own citizens, and so that could be a failure. On the other hand, a person never really knows what types of crises, what genocides have been averted because the UN was there, where you've had various peacekeeping missions over the years, and really peacekeeping, right? Not what we talk about now, peacemaking, which really is just a covert, brutal force, and not taking seriously the fact that you have local populations that have interests, and you need to have a force in place that is acceptable to the people who are living there. In a way, we've moved away from what I think has been a high point. Even if they haven't been as effective as they might have been, at least the philosophy behind what a peacekeeping force is supposed to be, I think those ideals are really important, and we've been losing some of that lately as we move away from a more multilateral world. So I think that's maybe a success at the values level. I think we can also think about its success on the sustainable development front, the whole development front, that includes things like people's economic security, dealing with issues of poverty. In a way, the Millennium Development Goals, looking at poverty, that really mobilized a lot of resources. And now that we're moving into these Sustainable Development Goals, I think that can also mobilize a lot of resources to target those who are most vulnerable. The fact that we are able to address famines, I think, more effectively than we used to be. It is last minute, it is always urgent, and it isn't necessarily structured in the best way it could be, but at least we're there. I think the UN is able to mobilize resources in that way, perhaps more effectively, given the information that it now has. I mean, there's a lot of social scientific research. People know that there's strategic intervention points too. So the UN's emphasis on education, recognizing that, you know, a lot of social distress can be dealt with effectively if you can get girls being educated, young girls. If young girls can get educated past the fifth grade, all of a sudden a lot of change happens for the positive. And the UN has been able to, I think, mobilize higher education organizations, universities, but also school systems in a way, with this decade of education for sustainable development, in a very creative way. So most universities now have sustainable development agendas, but where did those come from? And what role, or the United Nations University has sustainable development as its central focus. We now have over 100 regional centers of expertise on education for sustainable development globally that have been developed in the last 7 years with almost no resources. We've done it on the basis of goodwill, in-kind contributions, bringing together local networks of organizations to focus on their sustainable development issues locally, and then networking those globally in a whole global learning space for sustainable development. Well, that's an amazing, and given the lack of financial resources being put towards it, yet the UN has been able to broker that global network and learn from each of those regions into a global learning space. So that's fascinating. I think the other thing too, when we look at that type of a question and the idea that the United Nations has failed, we have to ask who's asking that question. Who doesn't like the UN and why? Well, I mean, in a way, large transnational corporations that don't really want to be accountable in terms of the living conditions of their workers, or don't want to be paying taxes in various places, or don't like their models of development being criticized because of their environmental impacts. They don't necessarily like the UN. Large global powers such as the United States, China, where they want to have a traditional empire, they don't necessarily aren't that excited about the UN, because the idea that there's a rule of law that is ethical, that transcends any one country, no matter how powerful it is. You can see why powerful countries aren't necessarily all that keen on that type of an institution. But doesn't that actually, if you've got those groups and organizations mobilizing to criticize the UN and say it's a failure, in a way that proves, on the flip side, that it really is a success, because there are global interests that actually don't like some of the ethical agendas of the UN, some of the democratic principles that are built into the UN, and see it as an obstacle to what they want to do. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Who asks the question? Who wants to set it up as a failure? And look at our own Canadian government. Our Canadian government used to be a champion of the United Nations because it was in our multilateral interests as a country, as a small country, to see those principles being advocated. And I hate to say it, I mean, our current federal government, I mean, partly because it has a fairly abysmal record internationally, but it's critical of the UN. But why is it critical of the UN? So I think in the long run, we need to question the question. We need to judge the UN against the criteria that it was set up for, those 4 criteria we looked at. And we also need to think about, well, what else would you put in place? Realizing that it's a government institution, so it will have all the strengths of governments as well as all the weaknesses of governments. And so when we hold it to a certain standard, we have to think about it in that way. But we also have to think about, what would you put in its place? What would that kind of thing look like? Would that type of organizational arrangement have just as many, if not more, problems than the United Nations has? Would a league of global transnational corporations be a good way of running the planet? Would you like that? And in a way, we're moving in that direction with these various trade agreements that put the investor as the primary stakeholder, and everybody else is just there trying to mobilize global growth to keep that market machine running. That's a future. It's a real future. It's a very different future than what the UN puts forward, that sees a diversity of production systems being valuable, sees a role for not only market institutions, but also for governments, for non-governmental organizations, sees a role for non-traditional market organizations, for example, cooperatives. Last year was the International Year of the Cooperative, declared by the United Nations. That picture, in my view, looks pretty good. On the flip side, if we want to replace it with something else to keep order at a global level, is it going to have the broad accountability? Is it going to have the long-term vision that the UN has? So far, that has not been on offer. Davos, Switzerland, you hear these debates. The G20, the G8, are they focused on sustainable development? Are they focused on the long-term success of everybody, including the world's poorest, and global ecosystems? I'm not sure. So, there's my view.
That's right.
A bit optimistic, but on the other hand, there have been real failures, even sustainable development. We cannot say that the planet is more sustainable now than it was 20 years ago. Things are not going particularly well from an ecological perspective in terms of wealth inequality and poverty. Yet, at least we are conscious of what is going wrong. And if the UN has played a critical role, it's been able to raise the consciousness of those global issues and measure them and call governments to account, which they may not like, and call corporations to account and call the voluntary sector to account. if there's a role for kind of a moral agent to do that at this critical moment in history, it seems that the UN is one of the primary organizations that has done it, but in a constructive way.
Terrific. Thank you very much.